Just have a seat on this chair, please. This is your second dose, right? So that's done.
Well done. So where we are in the middle of this centre, it was built to be a surge centre. So this is essentially emergency department bays that we're looking at.
Yes.
The centre's had to change though over the last year, I guess, because fortunately Canberra hasn't had a surge of COVID cases.
No, it hasn't. So it's actually been a very adaptable centre and we've been very lucky to have it. So initially we started COVID testing here and we did about 16,500 COVID tests from this site, and then very quickly we were asked if we could convert it into a vaccination site, and we were able to do that.
So when it was designed, it's basically split into two halves. And
It is split into two halves, so we've got two separate entrance areas for people to come in, and originally it was for the COVID positive people and COVID suspect as an emergency area, but we luckily haven't had to use that. This is actually where our medication room is. My nurses are very busy drawing up the Pfizer for the day. So the nurse will say, oh, I need 2. And then we open this hatch, and if we were vaccinating someone, some vaccine would have appeared from the nursing staff.
It's quite quiet at the moment now because it's before the centre opens. What's a typical day like here?
Oh, it's busy. So we're doing upwards of 800 vaccines a day here at the moment. So that's around about 100 people an hour coming through in 15-minute appointments.
The federal government is promising a ramp-up of the country's sluggish vaccination rollout.
To date, 854,983 Australians have been vaccinated. That's well short of the target of 4 million by the end of last month.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, the simple explanation of that is 3.1 million vaccines that never came to Australia. And so that is the reason. So there has been no slippage, there has been no delay.
The Prime Minister at great pains to say it's no criticism of the EU.
No, we certainly cannot confirm any new decision to block vaccine exports to Australia or to any other country for that matter.
Officials in Brussels denied blocking the export of COVID-19 vaccines to Australia.
It's straightforward maths. Now, I'm pleased to hear that the European Union overnight has indicated that they are not seeking to restrict these vaccines to Australia.
The federal government has just announced restrictions on the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for people aged under 50.
New advice overnight that people under the age of 50 should preferably receive the Pfizer vaccine.
In standing here tonight, I'm saying to Australians that we're being very upfront with you. There is this issue.
One of the government's biggest priorities this year is the vaccination program. We're repeatedly told that we should be able to offer all Australians their first dose by the end of October, but in a late night press conference that takes us back to 2020 almost, we're told that the medical advice has changed, and all of a sudden the workhorse vaccine, if you like, the AstraZeneca vaccine, isn't now recommended for people under the age of 50, and it throws the program right out the window.
AstraZeneca, that was the backbone to the vaccination program for this year, so the announcement ruined that, and you could see it on the faces of the Prime Minister, the Health Minister, Brendan Murphy and Paul Kelly. They were kind of shocked that they had to accept this advice. Perhaps it's advice that they regret having to take. But it has forced a massive rethink on not just targets, but also how do you get millions of Australians vaccinated when there is no recommended vaccine for them. We've got very limited supplies of Pfizer.
The federal government wanted the rollout to be its top priority. It wanted full credit for it going well because that's what it would take to an election. But now all of a sudden the Prime Minister's recalling National Cabinet to meet twice a week. They wanted to call it a war-like footing. I guess the difference to last year was the threat of the virus was so obvious and apparent, whereas now National Cabinet's being recalled because the vaccine rollout's not going well, and that's got nothing to do with a foreign threat.
War footing was all about conscripting the premiers and the chief ministers to the blame game, because the Prime Minister's copped it big time in recent weeks and months. So when it comes to spreading that blame, no better way than having a war footing, but it was curious, it didn't last for long.
One of the big questions though that the Prime Minister will continue to face is what is our new target? He said that he'd like to see Australians vaccinated by the end of this year, but he's used phrases like, you know, targets can be knocked about, there's too much uncertainty, and that has led to, I think, a fair point from the opposition that if we don't have a goal, how do we know what we're working towards and what we're measuring progress against?
And after telling Australians not to look at Facebook to get their health advice, he takes to Facebook.
Rather than set targets that can get knocked about by every to and fro of international supply chains and other disruptions that can occur, we're just getting on with it.
This is a view from the Prime Minister that he's held for some time, that social media is an evil, and yet he's quick to use social media when he wants to effectively avoid journalists asking tricky questions.
An attempted reset and a ministerial reshuffle, but the Prime Minister continues to struggle with the cultural reckoning on the treatment of women.
There has never been a stronger voice for women in an Australian government.
Nor this is the Worthington family chessboard, but I think you need to pardon my craft skills in cutting up. But we're trying to show how reshuffling a front bench is much like a game of chess.
Not exactly the production quality of the Queen's Gambit.
No, indeed. The point being the same, that you need to protect the King, and the King is Scott Morrison in this case. And we start the month and it becomes really clear that he has to reshuffle his front bench. He had to do that because Christian Porter, the Attorney General, was on mental health leave. He was suing the ABC, and as the nation's chief law officer, he can't be in the courts and the Attorney General at the same time.
And of course Linda Reynolds too, in hot water over her handling of the Brittany Higgins rape allegation, but also unwell. She gets admitted to hospital. Prime Minister decides to move her out of a big portfolio into a smaller domestic portfolio. So of course he can't do much with the Nats. They stay where they are.
And we know that there was a reshuffle last year, so we saw people like Alan Tudge and Dan Tehan take on new jobs. And the Prime Minister announced that he wasn't going to be moving the Finance Minister and the Treasurer. Greg Hunt, the Health Minister, he was quite keen to go on the move. He thought that Anne Ruston, Social Services Minister, could possibly take on his role, but the Prime Minister wasn't having it, so he remains in Health and Anne Ruston will remain in Social Services.
Now, Michaelia Cash, she's been acting Attorney General while Christian Porter's away, so she's now permanently moved into that role. And Peter Dutton has long eyed the defence portfolio and has finally got his wish, so he's moved into that bigger role.
And it's created an opening at Home Affairs. We know Stuart Robert is quite keen to move into Home Affairs, but in this climate of could a scandal-plagued minister be promoted to such a big role like Home Affairs, there was internal pushback within the government. So we know that he's leaving government services, but he's not off to Home Affairs.
No, Karen Andrews gets Home Affairs. She, of course, is being promoted at a time that the Prime Minister wants to be seen to be promoting women within his ranks.
So we know then Stuart Robert heads off to run employment, which Michaelia Cash has vacated. Christian Porter is now taking on industry.
And Linda Reynolds into government services and the NDIS. That's not all. There are other moves that the Prime Minister has made. In the midst of this storm about how the government's dealing with women's or so-called women's issues, he brings Melissa Price back into Cabinet in her role as Defence Industry Minister, but also creates additional portfolio positions for Amanda Stoker, who becomes the Assistant Minister for Women, and Jane Hume, who is the Minister for Women's Economic Security. They don't enter Cabinet, but they will form part of his task force.
And rather awkwardly, Marise Payne, the Minister for Women, is becoming the Prime Minister for Women.
Gets a short-lived promotion.
Short-lived, exactly. She has to sit alongside the Prime Minister briefly.
She is effectively, amongst her female colleagues, the Prime Minister for Women.
He quickly had to, of course, clarify that.
Well, because in chess you can only have one king, and so as much as she might be the Prime Minister for Women, she's in fact remaining just as a normal one, with him being the king.
But also in society, you expect your Prime Minister to be the Prime Minister of all people.
The former boss of Australia Post has delivered a stinging attack on the company's chairman and the Prime Minister.
As the head of the National Service hit back at her attempted public ousting by Scott Morrison in Parliament last year.
She can go.
It's all because of the Cartier watches affair.
They got watches
They were a Cartier watch.
Claims she was bullied out of her job.
She eviscerated the chairman of the Australia Post Board and the Prime Minister.
I don't know why the Prime Minister did what he did, but I was unlawfully stood down, I believe, because he instructed it.
What a piece of theatre that was. 3 women walking into that room dressed in white, and the way that the ex-Aussie Post boss managed to repackage her personal story into the broader story.
It also prompted questions to the Labor leader, people reminding Anthony Albanese that at the time of the Cartier watches scandal, he described her position as untenable. His response to that, well, I only said it was untenable because the Prime Minister made it untenable.
He effectively sacked Christine Holgate on the floor of the Parliament.
What nonsense. I mean, let's remember that it was Labor wielding the knife from the start with the questioning of Christine Holgate last year. They wielded it. The Prime Minister used it. He used it in a brutal fashion.
Scott Morrison denies that Christine Holgate's treatment had anything to do with her gender, but of course the government is sensitive to this issue because of the context that we're dealing with now, these broader questions about the treatment of women, not just at federal parliament and in politics, but in society more generally.
Everyone has a right to be safe at work. This is a culture we have to change right across our society.
And the quote-unquote liberal women's problem has really got nothing to do with women. The women are the ones that are sent out to explain why men in the Liberal Party have been behaving the way in which they are. And the focus is going to shift to these senior men in the cabinet to see what efforts they're doing to lead men across this country to stop treating women the way in which they have been.
It has taken years and cost lives, but finally, a silent war is about to be put on Australia's front line.
The soaring number of Australian military personnel who have taken their own lives in recent years will be examined by a royal commission.
I would love to show that we saved one life. The more we save, the better.
We must continue to act now on death by suicide of serving members of the Defence Forces, and I hope it will be a process by which veterans and families can find some comfort.
It's been estimated around 500 former Australian soldiers have taken their own lives in the aftermath of serving for the nation. This call for a Royal Commission into veteran suicide wasn't new in the slightest.
Well, they surrendered to public sentiment on this in the same way that they surrendered to calls for a banking Royal Commission. The government's initial position was to have a permanent standing commissioner looking at veteran suicide. They thought that that would be sufficient. So now we're going to have both. We're going to have the standing permanent commission, and then we're also going to have this Royal Commission which will allow families to air their grievances.
And then within days the announcement also from the Prime Minister that we're following the lead of the United States, and after almost 20 years withdrawing the last Australian troops from Afghanistan within months.
The quote-unquote forever war. Peter Dutton saying that don't expect us to be going back into that region anytime soon, that the focus solely needs to be on our region and the threat that China could pose throughout the region.
The leaders of 40 countries gathered online overnight for the Earth Day Summit.
Welcome to this historic Leaders' Summit.
Scott Morrison has resisted pressure by US President Joe Biden to further reduce Australia's carbon emissions.
For Australia, it is not a question of if or even by when for net zero, but importantly how.
Australia is being led by a cabal of climate criminals.
Scott Morrison dialed into a World Leaders Summit on climate change. He was talking, but was anybody listening?
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm not sure we're hearing you.
Yeah, we're just waiting for it to come up green.
Well, there are those technical issues, but things have changed in the politics of climate change. Donald Trump isn't there anymore to allow any camouflage for Scott Morrison. This is an unstoppable force. The Prime Minister is going to have to increase Australia's climate targets, and we will no doubt see him embrace net zero by 2050 in the next few months.
In a couple of days, we'll see the budget. The tree behind us, it's in full bloom. It's the
We're
budget
ready to go.
tree. The test that the government will have then, once it releases its budget, is then we start to get the indications of what the economy looks like without JobKeeper in there. And is it a V-shaped bounce back from the recession, or is it going to be a slower road out?
The government will be trying to find that sweet spot economically where you support but start to withdraw, and that's going to be the story of the next couple of years.